Everybody, so happy to have you here for the final session of the day, the Neurospirituality workshop. Yes, I like that. The round of applause is welcome. I feel like I should do some kind of a WWF like hype man intro, like, are you ready? Let's get some energy flowing through the room here. Yeah, I'm getting the approvals for that. Well, we have an amazing lineup of panelists. I am so honored to be speaking alongside Dr. Janae Nelson, Dr. David Yaden, and Dr. Rick Strassman. And then we're going to be joined also by fifth conversation panelist, Dr. Katie Devaney. Each of these individuals have expertise in various aspects of spirituality sciences, as you'll see across this workshop here. Dr. Janae Nelson received her PhD in developmental psychology from Brigham Young University. And Dr. Nelson uses diverse methodological approaches to study the development of transcendence, virtues, religiosity, and compassion in adolescence and emerging adulthood. Specifically, she's interested in contributions of unitive consciousness, spiritual perception, God proximity, and sacred rituals in psychosocial maturation. I'm going to go through and just upfront introduce each of the panelists. After the panelists present, I'll introduce our fifth discussant, Dr. Devaney, and we'll go through sequentially. I'll begin with my content, followed by Dr. Nelson, then Dr. Yaden, and then Dr. Strassman here. So Dr. Yaden is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, and he studies the measurement and experimental manipulation of altered states of consciousness. He currently works with Dr. Roland Griffiths, who did much pioneering work in psilocybin trials, and has also worked with Dr. Andrew Newberg and Dr. Marty Seligman, who respectively have pioneered fields of neurotheology and of positive psychology. He's authored over 40 scientific and scholarly publications and edited 2 books, namely Rituals and Practices in World Religions and Being Called. Dr. Yaden's research has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, Scientific American, CNN, BBC, and NPR. Dr. Strassman, I could go on so long about Dr. Strassman's characterization or qualifications. We're getting some fist pumps, Dr. Strassman, so you have fans in the audience here. He performed clinical research investigating the function of the pineal hormone melatonin, in which his research group documented the first known role of melatonin in humans. He also began the first new US government-approved clinical research with psychedelic drugs in nearly over 20 years, focusing on DMT and to a lesser extent psilocybin. Since mid-2008, Dr. Strassman has been writing full-time, and his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, an account of his DMT and psilocybin studies, has sold over 250,000 copies as of mid-2021 and been translated into over a dozen languages, including Mandarin. He co-produced an independent documentary by the same name, which was the most streamed independent drug documentary on Netflix. He is also the author of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, Joseph Levy Escapes Death, and a co-author of Inner Paths to Outer Space. He is currently a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine and lives in Gallup, New Mexico. And so once again, let's give a round of applause for our fantastic panelists here. To kick us off, the technology is working. Let's give a round of applause for our tech support as well. They're doing an amazing job at this conference. All right, so to warm us up talking about neurospirituality, I'm always curious to take a mystical temperature on the room. And so to establish a baseline, let's just have everybody stomp their feet, just so we can hear the baseline of everybody stomping their feet. Okay, nice. All right, so now I would like you to stomp your feet if you have ever had an experience you would categorize as spiritual or mystical. I love it. I love it. Okay. Wow. Okay, so let's also take a baseline, or excuse me, let's also take a reading. Stomp your feet if you have a practice, a regular practice that you identify as having a spiritual or mystical quality to it. Amazing. Okay. And then maybe we'll take a scientific temperature on the room as well. How many of you see value in applying scientific methods to topics of spirituality and mysticism? Oh man, it's a room full of friends. I'm so happy to know this. Okay, it makes me feel so much more comfortable. All right, so my name is Michael Ferguson. I'm an instructor in neurology at Harvard Medical School, and I'm the Neurospirituality Research Director at the Center for Brain Circuit Therapeutics at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I'm also a lecturer on neurospirituality at Harvard Divinity School and a fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. And I have no conflicts of interest to report. However, if anyone at this conference would like to change that status, I would be delighted to talk with you. At the Longwood Medical Campus for Harvard Medical School, there's a mural that has a very interesting proposition on the wall. It asserts that the evolution of medicine is in reality the history of man and his religion. And we can look across culture and across time, and there are examples of this conversation between medicine and religion being so intimate that they're indistinguishable from one another. And yet today, as we well know, we live in this moment where health sciences and spirituality have this wall that has been built right down the middle of them. And somehow we have all been duped into thinking that this is the norm, when, as a matter of fact, this is the radical exception if we're looking at the broader context of human history. It begs the question of whether this is an optimal relationship. And this is the type of question that neurospirituality seeks to address. You may be asking, what is neurospirituality? The prefix neuro, of course, references brain. Spirituality, I draw from the Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology's definition of spirituality. And it asserts that spirituality is a search for the sacred. Now, Dr. Yaden and I have some fun, colorful history over this definition. He and I were debate partners, you can say, at Oxford about 2 months ago over the topic of psychedelics and spirituality. And so I'll be excited to see if he ribs me again for this definition. But nevertheless, neurospirituality, then taking these two together, is the study of the brain's engagement with the search for the sacred. I'll also go ahead and I'll plant a seed for the questions in the conversation period where we're going to be all conversing together, because I'm very curious to hear how you define spirituality, how you conceptualize this term spirituality. Why should we study spirituality scientifically? Well, spirituality remains a pervasive cultural fact in societies across the globe. And so again, even if our personal epistemology or ontology does not really create space for spirituality, we ought to at least acknowledge that in the United States, for example, 92% of Americans report believing in a God or universal spirit, that this is a cultural fact that we really need to consider. Empirical studies have linked various elements of spirituality to adaptive and maladaptive aspects of human functioning. And so I want to make that clear too, that we're not only looking at this through a polarized lens of consideration, that there are maladaptive, in addition to adaptive aspects of spirituality we need to take into account. Clients and patients themselves, when we're looking at this clinically, are interested in therapeutic approaches that are spiritually sensitive and integrative. And lastly, for now, the American Psychological Association has defined religiousness as a cultural diversity variable. And a primary function of religious institutions is to promote spirituality. There are numerous scientific methods for studying spirituality. I think that what I come across most frequently is the perception that as soon as you're talking about studying the brain and spirituality, you're talking about task-based fMRI. And yes, this is a great way to study spirituality at the level of the brain. This is what I did in graduate school. I was at the University of Utah, and I was studying Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as Mormons. I put Latter-day Saints who had served volunteer missions, so these are highly religiously motivated individuals, into an fMRI machine. And they had a button box on their chest. And while they were participating in overtly religious tasks like prayer and scripture study, they would push the button when they were having a peak spiritual event. In the vernacular of LDS culture, this is referred to as feeling the spirit. And so I was able to go through and to look at each of these timestamps that phenomenologically by the participants were identified as spiritual moments where they were feeling the spirit, and observe what was the activated region of the brain that was elevated in these moments in contrast to baseline moments when they weren't reporting to feel the spirit. And a major component of this elevated activity was in the nucleus accumbens, part of the reward system, part of the attachment and the bonding system. I discussed these particular results in more detail in a TEDx talk that I was able to give titled, "This is Your Brain on God," and I encourage you to check that out if this particular study is of interest to you. But I want to talk about some of the more recent techniques that I've been using. This is a technology that's been dubbed lesion network mapping. As a quick side note, lesion mapping, in other words, looking at focal areas of brain damage and then associating them with changes in cognition and behavior, is actually an ancient technique. You can go back to the Byzantine Empire, for example, and in the 4th century AD, there were neuroanatomists that had functional maps of the brain where they localized imagination to the frontal cortex. They recognized that the midline of the brain was responsible for somatotopic and motor control, and they even called it the hegemonicon. And so, I mean, next time someone says, "That's so Byzantine," you should say, "I know, it's so advanced." With lesion network mapping, what we do is we take advantage of the fact that we now have a wiring diagram of the human brain that's been dubbed the human connectome. So instead of only looking at the focal area of brain damage, we can look at the whole circuit that's been damaged by a lesion. And this is a technique that I used for a report that was published in February of this year in the journal Biological Psychiatry. The title of the article is "A Neural Circuit for Spirituality and Religiosity Derived from Patients with Brain Lesions." As I was mentioning, you can look at multiple patients who all present with the same symptom and see that they have brain lesions that are localized to different areas. And so it's not as simple as having patients who all have the same symptom and then looking at their brain lesion locations and having them all align in the same area. But once we start looking at these different locations of brain lesions applied to the wiring diagram of the brain, suddenly we start to see that there is an underlying unifying explanation for why these different brain lesions distributed heterogeneously throughout the brain are causing the same behavioral symptom. The trait of interest that I'm exploring here has been termed spiritual acceptance. And scientifically defined, spiritual acceptance indicates a stable worldview, which includes forces that cannot be rationally comprehended or objectively proven. You can think of the opposite of spiritual acceptance as pure rational materialism, that you're only accepting as real things that you can, sensorially or physically demonstrate and logically prove. Example items for a psychometric evaluation of spiritual acceptance include the following. Sometimes I have felt my life was being directed by a spiritual force greater than any human being. I think that most things that are called miracles are just chance, which gets reverse scored. And religious experiences have helped me understand the real purpose of my life. So the individual fills out this questionnaire. They get a score that's a single value composite representation for their level of spiritual acceptance. In this study, we had a really unique patient base. These were individuals who were going through neurosurgery. And so now a neurosurgical lesion has some important characteristics that make it ideal for scientific investigation. Chief among them is that we can temporally anticipate a neurosurgical lesion. We know when it's going to happen. Unlike a stroke lesion, we don't know when a stroke lesion is going to happen. By virtue of the fact that we can temporally anticipate a neurosurgical lesion, we can now take a measure of a trait before surgery and then a measure of that same trait after surgery. And if you have a large enough sample, you can make statistical inferences that changes in those trait measures are associated with the areas of the brain that were surgically resected. This was a data set of 88 neurosurgical patients. And on this top row, you can see the 4 surgical locations that were associated with the greatest decreases in spiritual acceptance. And on the bottom row, the 4 surgical locations associated with the greatest increases in spiritual acceptance. And the main take-home point from this slide is that there isn't one singular region that accounts for these changes in spiritual acceptance. And so this is the exact type of problem that is ideal for a network mapping approach, as opposed to only looking at the location of the lesion. So with our 88 patients, we identify the areas of the brain that were resected. We look at the underlying connectivity pattern for each of those individual lesions, and then associate those with the changes of spirituality after surgery contrasted with before surgery. And the top association for changes in spiritual acceptance localized to brain circuitry of the periaqueductal gray. This was such an exciting finding to me because it was an unexpected finding. Periaqueductal gray is a brainstem region. It's quote unquote low level. I would have, if you had asked me to wager a guess, I would have anticipated that something like spiritual acceptance would be quote unquote higher level, cortically defined. And so this was very fascinating. Because it was so unexpected though, we really wanted to validate it. And so had a second independent data set of brain lesions associated with religiosity and performed a cross-validation analysis, which is the most rigorous type of validation we can do in this type of data set. In both data sets independently, we looked for the peak association with spiritual acceptance and religiosity. And in both data sets independently, observed a peak association in the periaqueductal gray. We then looked at the connectivity relative to those peak associations in the periaqueductal gray. And in that cross-validation fashion, statistically calculated the relationship of damage to that circuit with these trait measures of spiritual acceptance and religiosity. And in both directions, observed a statistically significant cross-validation effect. So what does this mean? From here on out, let me explain that anytime that you see these heat maps, these warm and cool color distributions painted onto the brains, that's depicting the functional connectivity of the whole brain relative to that brainstem seed in the periaqueductal gray. The warm colors indicate areas of the brain that have a positive functional relationship with the periaqueductal gray. And the cool colors, by way of contrast, indicate areas of the brain that have a negative functional association relative to the periaqueductal gray. So looking again at our surgical lesions that increase and decrease spirituality respectively, those surgical lesions associated with the greatest decreases in spirituality all damaged the positive connectivity to the periaqueductal gray, whereas those surgical lesions associated with increases in spirituality damage the regions that are negatively functionally connected to the periaqueductal gray. And you can think about this in terms of push-pull antagonistic relationships between networks, where the push network, so to speak, is like the accelerator of a particular behavior. The pull network is like the brake pedal on a particular behavior. And so in this case, the brake network would represent those regions that are negatively functionally associated to the periaqueductal gray. We think of them as inhibiting the periaqueductal gray's circuit functions. Whereas the push network would be all of those regions that are positively associated with the periaqueductal gray. When their activity increases, then that circuit activity is increasing overall. To further validate this circuit hypothesis, I looked for case reports of lesions that induced hyperreligiosity and identified 4 case reports that had clear enough brain imaging to associate them with our hypothesized circuit. And in each of those 4 cases where there were hyper-religious behaviors, the brain damage was to that negative circuit, or in other words, that circuit that we would predict acts like a brake pedal on this spirituality and religiosity system. And so what we're observing here is that if you damage that inhibitory system for the spirituality and religiosity circuit, you end up getting hyper-religiosity. All right, now this is an audience participation moment. Can anybody identify these 3 fine individuals? Let's see, yeah.
Number 1 is Saint Teresa of Avila.
Saint Teresa. How about 2 or 3? I heard of Joseph Smith. We got Joseph Smith. That's correct. Number 2 is Joseph Smith. Oh, there's got to be some Slavophiles in the room. Ooh, that's not a bad guess. That's not a bad guess. It is not Rasputin, though. Brothers Karamazov, the idiot. Yeah, it's Dostoevsky. And so what do all 3 of these historical individuals have in common? A lot, as a matter of fact. Number 1, that they were all extremely spiritually transformative in their cultural moments. It is also strongly hypothesized that each of them experienced what we would identify as epilepsy. It's been observed since antiquity that there is a strong association of epilepsy with spiritual experience. It's been dubbed the sacred disease. If a seizure has an onset within the hippocampus, that is more likely to be associated with hyperreligiosity than if the seizure has an onset zone in the amygdala. And so we tested that observation of hyperreligious seizures against our brain circuit for religiosity and spirituality. And indeed, the hippocampus, where you would have a more hyper-religious seizure, likely, if that's where the onset zone is associated with this accelerator system, if you will, for religiosity, fitting again with this hypothesis of periaqueductal gray circuitry defining spirituality and religiosity in the brain. All right, so one more observation that came across my Twitter feed was from a neurologist, Aaron Bose. And this is an image of a patient who had a brain lesion directly in the periaqueductal gray. And one of the chief symptoms for this patient was that they were unable to cry and to feel love, which are very stereotyped behaviors with religious expression and with spiritual expression. Okay, so now on this theme of alignment of other clinical symptoms with our circuit, I looked across the library of brain lesions that we're developing at the center where I work, the Center for Brain Circuit Therapeutics. And across a series of neurological and psychiatric symptoms, my goal was to test whether brain lesions causing specific clinical symptoms preferentially aligned with our circuit, or whether it was just random, the distribution of brain lesions relative to our circuit on the basis of their symptoms. And what I observed was a very strongly significant association. In other words, the symptom-wise relationship of lesion location with the spirituality circuit was not a random occurrence. And in fact, the 2 types of symptom-causing lesions that drove this effect were lesions causing Parkinsonism and lesions causing delusions. Lesions causing Parkinsonism acted like non-religiosity lesions. And this is convergent with multiple reports that with the progression of Parkinson's symptoms, you're more likely to see a decrease of religious motivation in these patients. On the other hand, delusion lesions acted like religiosity lesions. And this is the point where Richard Dawkins jumps out and says, "Ha, I told you, it's the God delusion." And I would say, Dr. Dawkins, we must be cautious about overly interpreting or incorrectly interpreting these results. So fallacies of interpretation really are an opportunity for us to learn both about ourselves and about our cultures. Let's look, for example, at the Parkinson's direction of association. It would be patently absurd and inappropriate to interpret these results as simply saying lack of spirituality equals Parkinson's. And yet, because of cultural and personal biases, it can be more difficult to see that the same fallacy applies in the relationship with delusions. It's equally absurd and inappropriate to interpret the results as saying that the presence of spirituality equals delusions. Well, what can we say then? Well, there are features that spiritual acceptance and delusions share, and I think that we ought to be attuned and alert to these similarities, especially if we're going to take things like spirituality and spiritual experiences seriously and scientifically. They're both associated with strongly fixed beliefs. And if we look at those anti-correlated networks relative to the periaqueductal gray, those regions that are the inhibitory, the braking system. They're defined by the frontoparietal network, which mediates logical reasoning. Looking at tasks that are in the core of that spiritual acceptance network, consistently, they're tasks associated with things like compassion, parental love, unconditional love. And when I see this, it to me is recapitulating a centuries-old dialogue about the relationships between reason on one hand and faith on the other hand, and a sub-conversation therein of the coupled relationship of faith with devotional love. Lastly, on this theme, I'll point out that a 2020 meta-analysis on compassion demonstrated that across 16 independent studies imaging the basis of compassion in the brain, the largest hub of compassion activity was in that axis between the periaqueductal gray and the ventral tegmental area. Again, indicating that there is a relationship at a deep brain level between spiritual acceptance and compassion, or they're closely associated analogs between faith and devotional love. All right, so now zooming out a little bit, I just want to talk about the big picture for me of where this research might lead us. And I think in terms of something like a brain circuits Rosetta Stone, where I imagine a day where we have symptom circuits identified, spirituality circuits identified, and then I think in terms of psychedelic circuits as well. And I can foresee an opportunity to look at the brain circuit homologs across these different categories of inquiry and identify ways in which specific brain circuits associated with clinical symptoms can be matched by their spatial topographical similarities to brain circuits associated with spiritual practices or with psychedelics, and then have an evidence-based brain circuit-driven coupling of therapeutic interventions. Beyond the clinic, though, I think that there is a massively juicy conversation to cultivate at the intersections of neurospirituality and human potential. And this is the last big picture concept that I'll say in my comments here. I want to introduce to you the notion of spiritual senses or modalities of sacred perception. The claim that there are spiritual senses that can be developed across the lifespan is a claim that appears throughout world spiritual traditions. And I think about spiritual senses in three dimensions of innate versus acquired, natural versus supernatural, and typical versus exceptional. To visualize this here in three dimensions, that first dimension is the innate versus acquired dimension, the second, the natural versus supernatural dimension, and that third being a typical versus exceptional dimension. This then gives us 8 categories of spiritual senses. And if we look at that corner at the point of origin, as it were, for innate, natural, and typical spiritual senses, I would propose to you that examples of innate, natural, typical modalities may include the sense of truth and the sense of goodness. Faculties that are widely, if not universally distributed across humankind. All right, so if you're clever, you may infer that the direction that this leads us to is a paradigm where our species is homo mysticus, that I strongly have a perspective of radically democratizing mysticism and spirituality. You are a mystic. If you have a sense of goodness and truth, that's a spiritual sense that is innate, natural, and typical, and it's beautiful. It then raises questions about interventions by which we can cultivate additional spiritual senses. These are some of the topics that I explore in a course I'm very fortunate to teach at Harvard Divinity School. It's a semester course titled Neurospirituality. This semester, I also had a wonderful opportunity to lead graduate directed readings. on the topics of mysticism and neuroscience. So you throw Bertrand Russell, Pseudo-Dionysius, LSD into the same room, and wonderful things start to happen. And then this semester, I'm also leading a cognitive neuroscience and meditation course at Harvard College for undergrads. And that's been really amazing to see the ways in which things like self-criticism can be so insidious and yet also spoken to so elegantly by practices like self-compassion that have been wisdom practices cultivated for centuries, if not millennia. If you're interested in checking out some of my ongoing work here, I invite you to peruse my website, neuromichael.com. I'm also on Twitter with the handle neuromichael, and that's a YouTube channel that I post content on as well. In conclusion, although there may have been compelling historical reasons to build a wall between science and spirituality, that time has passed. Can I get a foot stomp if you agree with me? Reintegrating health, healing, and spirituality is not a new idea, but it is a project we're now technically equipped to pursue in a first of its kind empirical fashion. Finally, brain circuit mapping and stimulation is an ideal scientific platform to support this type of project. The vision then is unifying health sciences and spirituality studies for the benefit of patients, ... and everyone else. The hope here is that by identifying brain circuits associated with diverse spiritual practices, we may eventually give clinicians a toolkit of evidence-based spiritual therapeutics that they can use to match to patients' specific symptoms. All right, so with that, I want to thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see this room full after dinner time. And let's give a warm welcome to our next speaker here, Dr. Janae Nelson.
Thank you. Sorry about that. We were having difficulty getting my PowerPoint downloaded, so we need to get some help. Thank you. Wonderful presentation by Dr. Ferguson. And I love how he spent so much time talking to us about spirituality as an outcome that we should all be interested in and studying scientifically. One thing that I'm interested in as a developmental psychologist is what spirituality can do for people and how that can help them across the lifespan. If spirituality can help with other outcomes. So we just talked about it as an outcome, but what about it as a mechanism or a moderator or a mediator to those positive outcomes in life? So I want to suggest that spirituality is a pathway to positive development and hope to back that up with some evidence that we found over the years. So a couple of years ago, we performed a systematic review of the scientific literature. All of the research that had been done over the past 30 years on religiosity and spirituality, specifically in adolescence. We were interested in that time period because it's a very precarious time period. It's a time of change. It's a time where a lot of people enter and exit religious affiliations, especially right now. But this is a unique opportunity to study spirituality as a positive outcome, or sorry, as a positive means to those outcomes. So just to give you an idea of what our search criteria were, we were looking for peer-reviewed studies, like I said, in adolescents, and that were empirical over the last 30 years. And those were the search criteria that we used. And then we did a targeted search because we were specifically interested not just in normal X to Y relationships. We wanted to understand mechanisms and processes that were going on to kind of begin to understand how religiousness and spirituality are actually leading to better outcomes in adolescence, because there's been so much research done on that it's a really robust finding at this point that spirituality and religiosity lead to positive outcomes. But what we don't know is why. What is it about religiosity and spirituality that's doing that? So we wanted to look at specific methodologies that could answer those questions. Correlated growth, bidirectional, experience sampling, experimental work, mediation, moderation, person-centered analysis, and then qualitative. So those are the different methodologies that we wanted to look at. These are the number of publications that we found that were within each of those methodological areas. And then after that, the results were screened based on some strict criteria to determine if the studies did address our research question about the processes and mechanisms of change. And the studies that did not answer those questions, that were just the bivariate relationships, those were screened out of our search, and we were left with these numbers of studies, 237. You can see that moderation and mediation were the most common types of methodological studies that we found. And that just makes sense, because the more sophisticated the method, the less likely that it's going to be done. All right, and these are the outcomes that were studied. So religiousness and spirituality were positively associated with academic achievement and negatively associated with substance use, externalizing, internalizing, but also with coping, and positively associated with coping and psychological well-being, negatively associated with sexual behavior. Overall, the story is that religion and spirituality prevent the risk behaviors, and they promote the positive behaviors in adolescence. All right, so these were the mediators that we found. So why is religion and spirituality actually doing these things? And parenting and family was the number one. So there's something about religious families that prevents these risk behaviors and promotes these positive outcomes. Some other dimension of religious and spirituality was another mediator, like potentially like prayer or church attendance. That could be a mediating factor. So people who prayed more are going to have less of those risk behaviors, for example. Values and attitudes was another mediator. So religion and spirituality is giving these youth these values and attitudes, and also good peers, but also psychological well-being. So religious kids are experiencing higher levels of psychological well-being, which then leads to those positive outcomes. Also, the religious and spiritual kids were the also higher on self-control and higher with academic achievement, and that more on pro-social behavior. Also, social capital and support was another mediator. I think I might have skipped over social control and norms. So these are the most common studied mediators. This explains what religion and spirituality is doing, why it's leading to these outcomes, and why it's protective. I think this is really important because we're at a point with the science of religion and spirituality that we're trying to understand how to help people who are not religious, how they can accommodate some of these benefits of religiosity and spirituality. How can we promote more of these positive family dynamics, for example? How can we help youth have more self-control? And how can we influence their academic achievement and their moral and pro-social behaviors? These are important questions, and religion has answered a lot of these questions for a long time. And we're at that point, like I mentioned, that maybe it's time to start to understand what it is about religion and spirituality that is creating this framework. And these mediators can answer some of those questions. And here's some moderators, the most common studied: gender, ethnicity, other dimensions of religiosity and spirituality, parenting, family. Some of these are similar. Neighborhood, socioeconomic status, all of these things are moderating the effect of religiosity and spirituality on outcomes. And also, we have two different roles here, because sometimes religion was the moderator and sometimes it was the predictor in these moderation studies. So we also looked at qualitative studies because it's just rich with information. And when you ask youth about their religiosity and how it helps them, their number one answer is that I get support. I've got mentors, I have friends. And so religion is providing this social network for them that is helping them have that positive development in their life. And then second down the line is they reported their beliefs, that their religion made them happier, they were better able to cope with the stresses of life, and so forth. So these are the different processes that were explained by adolescents when asked how their religion helps them. Okay, so all of this information that we got helped us to understand, as we're looking at religion and spirituality as a process, as a mechanism, that there's actually a lot of different ways to measure religiosity and spirituality. And that's where this gets kind of sticky, because for a really long time, the only thing that people were measuring is church attendance. But there's a lot more to being a religious and spiritual person, as you guys are well aware of. And we found through all of these studies in this review that there were these different dimensions of religiosity. Some of them were studied more than others, but we think that they all are valuable in helping us understand religiosity. And you can see that we have spirituality here as a subdimension of religiosity. I think that you could flip that and you could have religiosity as a subdimension of spirituality, but it's still the same idea. So we have ecological context, which are your family, your peer, your church support. This is like the building and the home of church. Then you have the cognitive dimensions, which are beliefs and like doctrine and those things. These are, so you can imagine, somebody might be a baptized member of one church, but if they don't know anything about the doctrine, they might be a different kind of a believer than somebody who has been gone to seminary and has been studying their religion for a really long time. They'll have a deeper, richer knowledge base. And so that's one thing that we need to measure when we're looking at religiosity. Of course, public involvement is one that has been the most classically studied, but the other behavioral components would be private practices such as prayer, reading Holy Scripture, and so forth. The affective dimension would get at things like identity, your motivation, religious salience, how important your religiousness is to you. Subsequently, we have found that religious importance is actually one of the best predictors of positive youth outcomes, even more so than church attendance or some of these other dimensions. And then under well-being, we have doubt and coping. And coping was one of the number one things that came up when you ask youth about their religion. And then spirituality, like I said, is a subdimension. We broke that up even more as we found through these studies that there was a theistic spirituality that's God-centered with a divine being as the core. And then there's this existential spirituality that is like connected to nature, or being one with the earth, or those sorts of things, being one with others. That had less to do with divinity, but more existential. And then we also included transformational experiences within that. So this was a really important finding from this systematic review, that we, as psychologists, we have to be really good at measurement. We have to be really precise so that we define and know what we're measuring, but also understand that religion and spirituality in particular is very complicated. You can see here that this is really complicated, and depending on how I measure it, I might get completely different results in my studies. So when we talk about religiosity and spirituality, are we using these more complex models, or are we just focusing in on church attendance as a form of spirituality? So this is how much these different dimensions were in the literature, showed up in the literature. So like I said, 27% was that church involvement, they're going to church. And then overall religiosity measure, there's like 3 questions, and it's really general and broad. That was about a quarter of the studies. Public involvement, so that's just church attendance. Sorry, the other involvement also included like prayer, and didn't differentiate that. Spirituality is 12%, and then family religiosity is 11%. So there's a lot more work to do. We don't have hardly any studies. Well, this has changed over since we concluded this systematic review, but there's not a lot on the cognitive aspects or the affective aspects or dimensions of religiosity and spirituality. So we hope to see that change. So some of the things that I would want you guys to take away from this is the importance of understanding the specificity of human development. And qualitative researchers are doing a better job at studying specific populations and underrepresented populations. For example, the qualitative researchers included populations such as homeless youth, refugees, and kids with various illnesses, and religious and sexual minorities. And we didn't see as much of that in the quantitative studies. But yeah, like I mentioned, religiosity and spirituality is all too often measured in terms of church attendance. And there's a lot more to being religious and spiritual than just going to church, although that is an important aspect, and it does predict a lot of positive outcomes. And secondly, most of the quantitative researchers focused on adaptive outcomes, but some maladaptive outcomes came up in the qualitative studies, such as people who were religious minorities experiencing hardships, such as Muslim Americans, and sexual minorities having tensions with their religious beliefs and their sexual orientation. So really important as researchers to go forward and studying all different sides of religiosity and spirituality. We've made some assumptions. We've made the assumption that spirituality is going to be positive for youth outcomes, as has overwhelmingly been demonstrated in the literature and the research. But we need to understand when it's maladaptive so that we can help those folks that are struggling. Last of all, we do need to look beyond risk reduction. Like I said, most of the studies were like looking at substance abuse and risky sexual behaviors and that sort of thing. But are we looking at things like purpose in life? Does spirituality help with that? Are we looking at pro-social giving and charitable giving, especially during these times where we've had lots of opportunities to give back? Are we looking at those positive outcomes and not just trying to reduce the amount of risk behavior that we have? So last of all, I want to use my most recent research as kind of a case study to dive into the theistic versus existential spirituality a little bit, and ask the question, do you guys think there is some behavioral or affective difference between the two? So theistic spirituality is God-centered. Existential spirituality, nature, other humankind. You think that there's a behavioral and affective difference? Yes, we're getting a yes. Some people saying no. No. Okay. Yes. Right, right. And so when I want to thank you for clarifying that. I want to say when I say theistic spirituality and I'm centering that on a divine being, I'm not saying that you have to belong to a specific religious tradition. So this is the different dimension. If I go back to this dimension slide, this is a different dimension. It's that sub-dimension we're talking about. We're not talking about religious tradition. So I would agree with you on that. But when I'm talking about theistic spirituality, we're making the assumption that there's some kind of attachment figure. There's some kind of person that you can pray to, and not just like the universe as some kind of ambiguous figure, right? Okay. So that's why I want to make that little distinction there. So if you are praying to a person, a being, a divine being versus maybe the universe, do you think there is behavioral and affective differences? You're still saying yes, you're still saying no. It's okay. Because the answer is both. So you guys are all right. Okay. We can all be right. I'm a mom, so I have to learn how to keep the peace with teenagers. Not comparing you guys to teenagers. I study teenagers. But yes, so sorry, let me go back to our slide here. The answer is both. And we demonstrated this with gratitude to God versus gratitude to humans and looked at the difference in the outcomes. So how we did this is we gave people different stories to read where they hypothetically received some kind of gift or favor from either a human or from God. And people were randomly assigned to these different conditions, the God conditions or the human conditions. And then we asked them some questions afterwards. And these are the results of these. So these are the whiskers on these are 95% confidence intervals, and the dots are are unstandardized regression coefficients. But they're on the same scale, so we can compare them. And you can see that this is comparing humans to God, and here you can see on this left side here, I wish I could use my pointer. You guys can you see my pointer? You can, awesome. That people in the human conditions felt less proximity, which means feeling close to the person that gave them the gift. So that we asked them, how close did you feel to this person after giving you a gift? They felt less close than people in the God condition. People in the God condition reported feeling closer, okay? You can see that there wasn't really a difference, a significant difference. This line here, if it crosses this line, that means there's no significant difference in gratitude, the amount of gratitude they reported and the amount of indebtedness they reported. Direct reciprocity is their desire to pay it back.
I'm confused. Is it human on the left?
So these are both, okay, thank you. I was gonna clarify it. These are from two different studies. So we replicated these findings, and so they're a little bit different, but you can see similar trends. One was in a BYU sample, and they're highly religious at BYU, and then the sample, this chart on the right is a national sample, nationally representative sample of about 1,000 people. So we found similar things, and here the proximity is crossing over that line, so we didn't find significance, but that trend is there. But we have positive affect being lower in the human conditions. And then the same trend with the negative affect here, that in general, you're feeling more negative affect in that human condition. But no difference in those other areas, which is interesting. So like I said, the answer is both, okay? So people in the God condition, and we did screen people out. They had to have some belief in God in order to be in the study. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense if we make them believe that they got a gift from God, then they don't believe in him. So these are people who believe in God, but of all different religious denominations and on all different spectrums of belief. So this is interesting. People who believe in God of all different kinds of religious denominations and religious importance, they're feeling closer to their benefactor when it's God, and they're feeling more happy. Specifically, we asked them, how much love do you feel and how happy are you? And they reported more of it in the God conditions. All of these findings were moderated by secure attachment to God. So the more securely attached you were to God, the more gratitude that you're going to experience. And the closer you're going to feel to God after he gives you something that makes sense. All these things make sense. So interesting that here that the more securely attached you are to God, the more benefit that you're going to get when you perceive getting a gift from him. So my takeaway from this is that if you're a religious person, the more religious you are, and the more secure you are in your relationship with God, the better benefits you're going to get out of an intervention that is God-centered. Does that make sense? And that makes a lot of sense to me, because if I'm going to try to have you have some kind of intervention with God and you don't have a very good relationship with him, that's probably not going to lead to positive outcomes for you, right? So but for for people who are believers and they have a secure relationship with God, this has a lot of great implications for spiritual therapeutics. That when you take a gratitude practice and you do gratitude towards God instead of to humans, you're going to magnify those positive results. So in conclusion, I do want to say that spirituality and religiosity is a developmental asset, with the caveat that we also need to understand when it's not. And theistic spirituality enhances outcomes in people who have secure attachment with God, as shown in those interaction effects. And I just want to thank quickly the John Templeton Foundation for funding our research, my co-investigators, Sam Hardy and Diane Tice, my research assistants, and also Dr. Ferguson for inviting me. I'm so thankful to be here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nelson. We're going to move on to Dr. Yaden's comments. I think we'll just leave this open here. Oh, gotcha. Okay. Sorry about that. Little tech swap moment here. All right. And by all means, please store up all of your questions, all of the controversies that are fomenting in your mind, and we'll bring them all to the discussion with the panelists after we go through our presenters here. Moving on to our third of four presenters, Dr. Yaden, as I mentioned, he's an assistant professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, doing work on altered states of consciousness. And Dr. Yaden, we're ready to have you take the mic. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Michael?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, great. And can you see my slides? I can't see anybody. Oh, good, good. Okay. So I'm just going to start talking to this empty room.
There you go.
Hello,
it's
everyone.
Actually, a really full room right now.
Oh no, I meant my room is empty. My wife is sleeping in the other room. It's like 11 o'clock at night here on the East Coast, but I'm delighted to be with all of you. Okay, so today, and I have 20 minutes. Is that right, Michael? I'm going to start a timer.
20 would be great, but you do you, Dr. Yaden.
Oh, don't tell me that. That's dangerous.
Okay.
All right. So today I'll talk about forms of consciousness. I'll explain what I mean by that phrase, and particularly looking at what we can study regarding consciousness and things about spiritual and mystical experiences, and maybe more importantly, what we can't. And I'll probably leave most of the can't to the discussion, but hopefully that will be a fun thing for us to all talk about. So I really like the way Michael opened today's session by asking you to tap your feet if you'd had a religious, spiritual, mystical, or self-transcendent experience. So I want you to take a moment to take a nice deep breath in and just think about that experience. Just call it to mind. Just call whichever of those experiences come to mind first. Just take a moment to reflect on it. You know, we're all having our attention face outward very much as we're in these conference proceedings. So just take a moment to reflect to that inner space. Okay. So the kind of experience that many of you have probably had and were calling to mind, these experiences have been described since before recorded history, very likely. We see them in depictions on caves and in art, but certainly since recorded history, we've seen the ancient Greeks discuss these experiences. The leaders of every major world religion discuss them, as well as devotees and followers and saints and sages through the ages. Here's just one example from my favorite book, William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. This is a Christian woman saying, "I felt myself one with the grass, the trees, birds, insects, everything in nature." Okay, so we have these kinds of experiences from religious people, and we see them recorded in religious texts. However, we also see them recorded in quite different texts, which maybe don't immediately spring to mind. So these are books by well-known atheists and agnostics, recording very, very similar experiences phenomenologically. That is how it feels, but giving those experiences very, very different interpretations. So here's Bertrand Russell, for example, who Michael mentioned, great 20th century philosopher who was an atheist, but who had had a mystical experience, which created a great deal of positive benefit in his life, yet he ultimately characterized as a delusion. So what I'm doing here is drawing your attention to the distinction between what it feels like, that is the phenomenology or the subjective experience that we have in consciousness, and the interpretation or the kinds of inferences that we draw about the nature of reality or the nature of consciousness. Those are two quite different things. And so I want to draw that distinction, separate it in your mind as we go through these discussions. And in order to do that, there's a useful tool called bracketing, as introduced by Husserl, German philosopher, who described phenomenology. And the way that he talked about bracketing was that we could think about and call to mind an experience, just like how I had you do at the beginning of this talk. And we can think and examine very carefully the subjective qualities of that experience, but we can bracket out our interpretations and our inferences about the experience. So that is, we can leave out our interpretations to some extent. Now, just how much we can do that is a very deep question, because of course our interpretations and our expectations play a role in shaping the experience as well. We'll get to that a bit later, but for the time being, I think this is a really important point, that you can look at an experience and examine the subjective qualities and the phenomenology without drawing an inference about what that experience may mean about life, the universe, and everything. And this is exactly the approach advocated in William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, which I mentioned before. I really recommend this book. If any of you haven't read it, I think you'd love it. I certainly did. I loved it so much that I wrote a book on that book. And so I have a book coming out with my co-author, Andy Newberg, in just a couple of months. It's called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. Basically, we say that William James had a lot of really important insights that we can bring forward. And then we review the past couple of decades of psychology and neuroscience and psychopharmacology on these kinds of experiences. Okay, so very quickly, we'll move through a few topics: theory, measurement, and applications. So theoretical foundations, we'll take a nod from William James. And this is how he described our topic here. Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. So it's interesting, in the very beginning of this book, William James describes, he almost uses the phrase altered state of consciousness, not quite, but very close. But he quickly moves from this kind of altered states of consciousness language to talking in terms of religious, spiritual, mystical experience. And so, he recognized that most people when they have these alterations in their consciousness, they attribute religious, spiritual, mystical qualities to them. It's not a necessary jump, but it's one that's very common. And so I appreciated in the last talk the breakdown of different aspects of religion and spirituality. There's many ways to break apart these various elements of religion and spirituality. Here's one that I use in my book. We think of religion and spirituality as very similar, whereas religion is more institutionally focused. Spirituality is just simply less so. And there's a secular way you can think about spirituality, and there's a supernatural way you can think about it. But we don't have enough time to really delve into the definitions here. But notice the acronym, there is an acronym here, and it spells praise be. Unfortunately, that was actually an accident. But we'll focus on experience today, and note the brackets. And so it's possible to focus on experiences without requiring attributions of beliefs. Okay, this is something that I'll bring up a few different times, and I think it will inform our debate. This is something that came up in, Michael and I had a debate at Oxford, and this concept kept coming up, mostly because I kept forcing it to come up. So this will probably come up in our discussion afterwards. But there's this notion of a Motte and Bailey. And the idea is most people want to hang out here in the Bailey, you know, where they can farm and there's more space to spread out. But when pressed, when there's attackers, they retreat to the Motte. So the Motte is a name for a fort, basically. And so what happens is the Bailey is a kind of a loose, bold, controversial claim. And then the retreat is to an obvious, uncontroversial statement. Okay, so here's one example. So someone might say crystal healing cures illnesses. And then, you know, if you're a scientist or scientifically minded, you press them on that and you say, well, really? And they say, well, you know, placebo effects are powerful and the mind's a powerful thing. And yeah, I don't really know if the crystals really work or not. Another common thing that comes up in this domain with spirituality is claims about a kind of supernatural spirituality, where people will make claims that there's a soul, a non-physical soul, and it seems clear that they're talking in those kinds of terms. But then if you push them, they'll say, oh, no, what I mean by spirituality is something like gratitude. And by that measure, then all of us are spiritual, and the term sort of loses its meaning. So when we get to the discussion, we'll just want to be careful about the way we use our terms and try to be consistent across our use of terms. This is a slide I added to Mike in contrast to Michael's tearing down the wall between spirituality and healthcare. I actually think the wall is important, and so I want to build a wall between secular spaces and religious and spiritual kinds of practices, even though I'm very much hugely for the study of religious and spiritual practice and their applications when it's very intentionally done. And so actually, I suspect Michael and I agree much more than disagree on this point. But I thought this would be a fun point for discussion. Okay, so these kinds of experiences, it turns out we can measure them. I appreciated in the last talk hearing the emphasis on the importance of measurement. William James drew from psychometric measures done by his student, Edwin Starbuck, back in 1890s, asking people to describe their experiences. And you see, even then, sense of oneness, spontaneous awakening, divine aid. And we've come a long way in these kinds of measures. So here's a Gallup type measure, a very large measure of the population. And people were asked, have you felt as though you were close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself? So just try to guess what percentage of the population of the United States agreed with this statement. So just write down or say a number out loud. Just make yourself guess, make yourself actually pick a number, okay? Okay, so about 40% of the US agreed with this statement. I found that amazingly high when I first heard that number. And that's extremely consistent across many, many surveys in the US and the UK in the decades, across the decades. Here's a Gallup question, very, very similar. And that one was 41%. And when we look across the US population, when we look at tribal contexts with hunter-gatherer tribes, and when we look at professors of philosophy, we see different prevalence levels, but we see in each of these cases definitely endorsement of these kinds of experiences. In addition to these single items, there are scales, there are measurement scales, there are a number of problems with these measures. The biggest problem, I think, is that there's not enough attention paid to the different elements of religion and spirituality, and there's not that bracketing that I mentioned. So a lot of times beliefs will be mixed in with experiences, and this adds noise to these measures. These experiences, I keep using that phrase, they go by many names. Here's just a small sampling of the literature on these experiences. If you Google any of these, you'll find a small literature on each. So there's a lot of synonyms. When we ask people, well, what do you actually prefer to call these experiences? Spiritual came out on top. That's why we titled our book, Varieties of Spiritual Experience. But when we break this down between people who endorse supernaturalism, so the belief that the mind is somehow goes beyond the physical brain, or that there's a larger mind beyond the physical universe, believers in that, they prefer spiritual overwhelmingly, and then religious, and non-believers, transcendent, self-transcendent, awe. Spiritual isn't too far down, but it's definitely not nearly as endorsed. And so there's really interesting things we can do by looking at the phenomenology of these experiences and asking people about them. So I'll just give you a small sampling of some of those things that we can find. So just the average length of a spiritual experience, it's about half an hour. And can last anywhere from a few minutes to an hour. This is what people report, at least. When we ask people for persisting changes in well-being, was the experience ultimately a strong positive influence on your well-being, or was it negative? We see overwhelming evidence for strong positive. And this is just evidence from a small survey, but we have dozens of surveys and also causal studies looking at this now. When we ask people how long was your well-being impacted for, people said that this 30-minute or so experience ended up impacting their well-being for weeks, years, or decades. And I find that extraordinary, that it's possible that very brief mental states can have positive, persisting impact that lasts for years or even decades. That's extraordinary. And so that obviously brings to mind the idea of, well, maybe we can leverage these kinds of experiences. And that's exactly what's happening. And this is one of the most exciting fields in psychiatry right now, is that when we ask people for triggers of these experiences, psychedelic substances naturally come up anyway. Interesting grief at the top of this particular survey, something we hadn't seen before. But you'll see there's a lot of very different triggers here. If you try to find the red thread that unites all of these various triggers, it's very difficult to do. I've tried quite often. But you see psychedelic substances here. And so at my lab, we're currently inducing these kinds of experiences fairly regularly with psilocybin. Familiar with psilocybin from mushrooms. It's a classic psychedelic. And our next speaker, Rick Strassman's an expert on the topic. But in our clinical setting, we have a very controlled and safe and supportive setting to introduce these experiences to people. In addition to medical and psychiatric screening, participants go through a number of preparatory sessions to build rapport with the person who will be sitting with them and to understand their experience, what it might be like. And then at the experimental session, at the actual drug administration session, it's generally a couch with eye shades and headphones for music. And 2 guides are there to provide psychosocial support. And these experiences last about 6 hours acutely. And so a number of studies now, well-replicated result is that compared to, say, methylphenidate in this example, which is Ritalin, you get very, very high endorsement of a mystical type experience with psilocybin compared to methylphenidate. When we look across studies, we see that people's mystical experience score, how intense they felt that their experience of unity was, more or less, the higher that was, the lower these therapeutic effects are weeks or months later. And so lying there on the couch, if your mystical experience score is quite high, then weeks later, you'll have lower smoking craving, you'll have lower depression, you'll have lower anxiety. So there's something about these subjective effects, or the quality of the phenomenology itself, that impacts therapeutic effects after the fact. What kinds of impacts? We see positive mood change, altruistic social change, positive behavior change, and high ratings of meaning and increases in well-being. These are huge effects, very, very large effects. And here's, I think, the most important slide in all of psychology in the past 2 decades. And this is ratings of meaning. What this shows is that 2/3 of the participants who were administered psilocybin rated the experience among the top 5 most meaningful moments of their entire life. So lying there on the couch for 6 hours in the lab, it becomes one of the most meaningful experiences in life. I think that's an extraordinary finding. So will psilocybin be prescribable for mental disorders like mood and substance use disorders? That's the question. We need to do more research first, need to replicate bigger samples, more diverse samples, better controls, better blinding. If you want to know some of my worries about this, you can read an article I wrote on the topic. I think there are real risks as well as real benefits to consider. Now, there's a parallelism as I finish up here between what I discussed about looking at the interesting subjective qualities in the phenomenology and then making leaps to inferences about life, the universe, and everything that often happens in the study of spiritual or mystical experiences. I think we also do that when we talk about consciousness. And so I wrote a paper on psychedelics and consciousness, and the point, a few basic points in that paper were, I think at present, there's no reason to believe that psychedelics or the study of mystical or spiritual experiences will provide any kind of information relevant to the hard problem of consciousness. Of course, we're open to the possibility of being proven wrong, but it just doesn't seem like there's any reason to believe we're going to gain traction on that. But psychedelics are proving useful tools for researchers investigating many of the so-called easy problems of consciousness, and there's a lot of potential there. Specifically, the altered states of consciousness they produce may alter one's beliefs about the nature of consciousness, and that's something actually that we're starting to demonstrate, and we have evidence for that. But the question is still, with these altered states of consciousness, what qualities are important to induce changes? Why? How does it work? Under what conditions? These are all the kinds of things that we should be really fascinated by and seeking answers about. And remember our Mott and Bailey. So I think we sometimes see people making claims like psychedelics will explain consciousness. And I think what they want to say is that will gain traction on understanding the hard problem of consciousness. And then when you press them, they say, well, psychedelics can induce states of scientific interest, right? And that's a much less controversial claim. We all agree with that. And I think we really need to watch out for these bold, controversial claims because they can blow back on us. I think we're in a bit of a psychedelic hype bubble, and that can be dangerous. And so I think we can all play a role in bursting hypey statements when we see them out in the wild. Psychedelics aren't going to cure mental disorders. They're not going to explain the nature of consciousness. However, they can do lots of really, really interesting things therapeutically and scientifically. And those are the kinds of questions that I think we should be focusing on and thinking about. So thank you for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yaden. We're going to toggle to our final panelist presenter, Dr. Strassman, at which point we'll have all of our panelists come forward, engage in some dialogue together, and then open up the dialogue for the audience to participate as well. And lest I forget, let me go ahead and make it a point to announce right now that tomorrow morning, the meditation led by Deepak Chopra will actually begin at 7:30 rather than at 8 a.m. as advertised in the conference schedule, in order to allow sufficient time for us to enter into transcendental or imminent, depending on your ecstatic or enstatic preferences for mystical narrative states before we go into our first workshop or our first presentation at 8:30. Okay, so 7:30 a.m., Deepak Chopra leading meditation. Be there or don't be altered. Okay, Dr. Strassman.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. So I want to thank Dr. Ferguson for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to be talking about two different poles of spirituality that we ought to consider when looking at the effects of psychedelics on spiritual experience. The two poles are what I end up calling the unitive mystical state or the interactive relational state. And I put psychedelic spirituality in quotes because of some of the concerns of Dr. Yaden. We want to keep things bounded if we can when discussing psychedelics scientifically. Let's see. There we go. So spiritual experience, it seems like everybody's got a different definition of spiritual or spiritual experience. The definition I work with is one I pulled from my dictionary a number of years ago. So spiritual refers to thoughts, feelings, images, ideas, which possess the highest qualities of the human mind. Other synonyms are holy, sacred, pure, and they're categorically different than everyday. It could also refer to things incorporeal or invisible, including one spirit or soul. And it can also extend to, a divine being, God's spirit or word, or the individual soul upon which God acts. So one of the chat questions was the difference between spiritual and not religious. So what's the difference between a spiritual experience and a religious one? I think, phenomenologically, as I'll be discussing in a few minutes, they're indistinguishable. But one occurs within a religious container, a more or less traditional religion. And if you have a spiritual experience within a religion, is called a religious experience. So even people who claim that they're spiritual but not religious, if you ask more questions, it'll usually be the case, that they do, possess, some organized beliefs and practices. I suppose an individual religion, pagan, New Age, things like that. So the two types I mentioned earlier are the interactive and the relational, the interactive relational and the mystical unitive. And those can occur within or outside of a traditional religious structure. So the characteristics of a mystical unitive state, I think, the hallmark is a loss of the sense of self. And there's a merging and a unity with the ground of being, with the white light. It's usually free of images and content. What's called, what is referred to within Buddhism as shunyata, or emptiness. There's transcendence of time and space, although I'm not really sure what transcendence of time and space means, but still it's a common characteristic of the mystical unitive state. One is convinced that the experience, or what one is undergoing, is more real than real, and it's usually nonverbal. The experience isn't like the spoken word. With regard to it being ineffable, which means it can't be described by words, I'm not sure if that's really true. There's been a lot of ink spilled about ineffable spiritual experiences, and it also may simply be the result of lack of vocabulary. So the paradigmatic, at least within my experience, is that of Kensho in Zen Buddhism. There's no form, feeling, perception, consciousness, or volition, as described in the Heart Sutra. So the interactive relational state is content rich, and the paradigmatic psychedelic experience, which is interactive relational, is the DMT state. There is a maintained sense of a separate self, and that self interacts and relates to the content of the experience. Time and space continue, more or less. The mood effects, can be variable. It's also full of information, sometimes verbal, depending on the development of one's, rational faculty or, verbal faculty. It can be more or less verbal. Like the mystical unitive state, it is more real than real, or it appears that way. And the paradigmatic interactive relational spiritual experience is the prophetic experience as described in the Hebrew Bible. So spiritual experience, they can be religious or non-religious. They could be interactive, relational, or mystical unitive. So the DMT state is interactive relational. We didn't spend a lot of time preparing people. We mostly told them it starts very quickly. it peaks quickly and it's over quickly. You may feel like you've left your body, but don't worry, we've got things under control. So it was, basically, we're going to give you a number of doses of DMT. Go in there, you keep your wits about you, and when you come down, describe the experience. And with those kinds of instructions, there is really only one mystical unitive state. In the case of nearly 5 dozen subjects. And interestingly enough, that one individual with a mystical unitive experience was a fellow with a long-standing interest in mystical unitive states. He was a religious study major in college, and belonged to a religious organization that cultivated mystical unitive experience. So I was expecting mystical unitive experiences because of my Zen background, and most of the volunteers in my study were also practitioners of Eastern meditation. So they were also expecting mystical unitive states, but it was contrary to everybody's expectations. So instead of Buddhism, or specifically Zen, being an appropriate or a relevant spiritual platform, I went back to the drawing board and looked for other religious systems which emphasized the interactive relational experience. So that turned out to be the Hebrew Bible, prophetic experience. Most people, think of prophecy as foretelling or predicting, but that's an artifact of the Greek translation, from the Hebrew. The Hebrew word, for a prophet is navi, which means to interpret, to be a spokesperson for. So predicting isn't, necessary. It's any spiritual experience had by anyone in the text. It isn't only the the canonical prophets. So if you expand the definition, the phenomenological correspondence with the DMT state and the prophetic state is quite striking. All you need to do is to open chapter 1 of Ezekiel, and there's beings, there's wings, there's eyes, there's flying through space, there's roaring sound, there's paralysis. And it's interesting, in the entire 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, there is not one account of mystical unitive experience. It's entirely interactive and relational. So the prophet maintains their sense of self. That's even stronger than usual in most cases, and they speak with God or God's angels. So there's references to mystical unitive experiences in later streams of Judaism, but those are syncretic developments, Kabbalah, and Hasidism. In the text itself, the foundational text, there are no such experiences. So I compared the two states. It was an 18-year project. Taught myself biblical Hebrew all over again, and this book came out in 2014, and it compares and contrasts the DMT state and the prophetic state. So the relationship is quite well developed in prophetic experience, not quite so well developed in the DMT one, and I think it's because of the set and setting issues. But the main purpose of the relationship is to communicate information, and that could be personal, it could be cultural, it could be cosmic, and the beings which are reported frequently in the DMT state and obviously in the prophetic state, they can heal or harm, they can guard, they can bless, they can be ambiguous. But communication is key, and it's information that's being communicated. So most people, when they're talking about psychedelic spirituality, it's the mystical state, it's the mystical unitive consciousness. So what's the difference? Well, the interactive relational state possesses specific verbal cognitive information, which is baked into the experience. There's a voice of God, or voices of angels speaking to you, their words, and you can write them down. So if you have questions later, you refer to the text. So you can refer to the text when you're sober. In the mystical consciousness, the cognitive interpretation is an overlay of an essentially non-verbal experience. So you can make things up as you go along, which is one of the dangers, I think, in emphasizing the non-verbal experience over a verbal one. And if you have questions, you would return to the mystical state, as opposed to, for example, looking at a text which has more or less transcribed the verbal message of an interactive relational experience. So with some being tongue-in-cheek, I've coined the expression the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness, which I think bespeaks the zealotry which can emerge from taking psychedelics, either in the field or in a research setting. And it isn't only within those research subjects. It can also be investigators. They can become religiously obsessed. So if you've got a mystical experience goal, then if you achieve it, you're proud, and if you don't achieve it, you're ashamed. And that's supported by the mystical experience questionnaire, which will grade your experience as either a complete or an incomplete mystical experience. And everybody wants a complete one, of course. And even an incomplete one would be better than than none at all. So the failure to attain a mystical experience, if that's the goal, and the goal is going to heal you, that can lead to catastrophic outcomes. And a number of years back, there was a suicide in the Hopkins psilocybin terminally ill study in an individual that got a microscopic dose of psilocybin and obviously had no mystical experience and was disheartened, and he killed himself 11 days later. So the mystical school of consciousness is predicated on mystical experience is good for you, and that's the message that we've been listening to this evening. That religion is good for you, a more religious experience is good for you, and that may not be the case. So the mystical experience questionnaire, it derives from a notion of an underlying universal spiritual experience, which is possible in all people. With respect to the MEQ, there is strong evidence that outcomes do correlate with scores. But on the other hand, other states may correlate just as strongly with outcome if those other states were measured. In Canada, when they were doing a lot of LSD studies, for alcoholism, their model was that LSD mimicked the DTs. So if you had a DT rating scale, there could have been correspondence between improvement in drinking behavior and the DTs. And you could also have malignant outcomes may correlate with MEQ scores if those malignant outcomes were measured. For example, the effects of LSD on Charles Manson and his followers. So Michael Bogenschutz at NYU makes a pretty strong case that it's the intensity of the experience as opposed to the specific flavor of the experience, which is the most important thing. And clearly, if you're comparing Charles Manson, with other, or if you're comparing outcomes in the Manson model as opposed to the mystical experience model, the set and the setting direct the outcome. Either you're a confirmed, serial killer, or you stop drinking. So I think there needs to be an alternative to the mystical unitive state as a subject or an object of study within the psychedelic spirituality field. We live in an interactive relational world. Most psychedelic experiences are interactive and relational. The wordless, nature of the mystical unitive state, can lend itself, to abuses. And if you're, positing a mystical unitive experience underlying all the major religions, you may start slipping, down the slope of religious intolerance. So Bill Richards, a few years ago, the lead therapist at Hopkins, published a guidebook called Sacred Knowledge. And I like to refer to it as the foundational text of the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness. So it posits, or it is predicated on the notion of a universal religion, which is hardwired into the brain, and it produces healing, through the mystical experience. But you can kind of stumble on, what is the universal religion? Who defines the universal religion? And in Bill's book, it's a combination of Eastern religion, mystical Christianity, New Age beliefs. But what if you don't agree with the universal religion? You're either called, somebody that hasn't quite, gotten it, or you're persecuted. And in Bill's book, it's quite striking on the antagonism that he expresses toward interactive relational psychedelic states. He calls them inferior. They're the mountain peaks are the mystical states, and the foothills are the interactive relational states. And he points to my book specifically. This is a prophetic states book. So if you're antagonistic, to the state, then you can't help but be antagonistic, to the religious tradition, for whom that state is, primary, and that is, Hebrew biblical prophetic experience. So in a couple of pages in the middle of the book, Bill denigrates the biblical prophets. He denigrates scripture, saying it can be replaced, and he offers his own 13 insights at the end of the book, outdoing Moses by 3. He glorifies Jesus, Paul, Christianity, and Eastern religions. He hints at psychedelics, the frequent citing of Jesus in psychedelic research as perhaps implicating or perhaps ushering in a second coming. And he speaks about a couple of Jewish patients as problematic. They're too rational. They don't have the vocabulary to describe mystical states. They had a mystical experience, but don't want to share it. One of my mentors at UNM was a fellow named Eberhard Uhlenhuth. That's his real name. And he was at Hopkins for years. He was the acting chairman at the University of Chicago. So Uhlenhuth was a site visitor to the University of Maryland Spring Grove project, psychedelics in the 60s and early 70s. And when I was expressing my admiration for that work path, back then, he kind of chastised me and explained it by saying they got religion. And I asked, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, they were convinced that the mystical experience was all that they needed to know, that they discovered it was healing, and there was no more reason to look at mechanisms. It was more a question of what conditions would respond to it. And their grant was not renewed because they stopped being scientific. And in a way, that model lives on, and it's just been, transplanted, to a more prestigious university or universities. There's more statistical firepower, supporting that notion or, that belief. There's more, biological data. But still, the model lives on. The front matter of, sacred knowledge is there's no revelation without salvation, which means if you have this experience, you'll be saved. So that could be alcoholism, it could be depression, existential distress, OCD. But that's a Christian notion. It's not a Jewish one for sure. And it bespeaks a Christian idea, that revelation is a miracle. And Bill, gives lectures with titles like Revelation Now. So it still has a lot of religious overtones, the whole mystical experience school. So what's the alternative? Well, we should just remove theology. This conference is called the science of consciousness, not the religion of consciousness. So I think instead of prophecy, mystical experience, I think if you wanted to think about two poles of the spectrum, one is the interactive relational psychedelic state, in which case there's the maintenance of the self. At the other end of the spectrum is a unitive state, which is characterized by ego dissolution. And I think we ought to study interactive states that occur on psychedelics, develop a rating scale and see if scores correlate with desired outcome.
Amazing. I have to say, I thought that I was ready to see sparks fly between Doctors Blackmore and Doctors Chopra, but I think that the real sparks would fly between Dr. Strassman and Dr. Richards. So next year's Neurospirituality panel, maybe we'll have that happen here. Thank you so much, Dr. Strassman.
Yeah, I would love that, actually.
I would too, to be honest with you. We're going to go ahead and welcome up Dr. Janae Nelson, in the analog world, and then in the digital world, Drs. Yaden and Dr. Strassman, and then also bring Dr. Devaney up, who's going to help moderate our discussion. Primarily, I've invited Dr. Devaney here to make sure that Dr. Yaden does not retire to his mott after his statements here tonight. Haha, I can't see your reaction, but I trust it's a good one, Dr. Yaden. All right, by way of introduction, Dr. Catherine Devaney is a contemplative neuroscientist conducting brain imaging investigations of meditation and attention. And she's previously collected fMRI data at Harvard Medical School, Boston University, IIT Delhi, MIT, and is currently directing a fantastic program. Number one, actually a fantastic dual set of programs. Number one is a meditation research lab at the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. And she is also the co-founder and executive director for the Alembic, which is a new metasystemic practice space in Berkeley, California. We're so happy to have you here. All right, and let's go ahead and bring up Drs. Yaden and Strassman onto the video screen here, and we'll get started. Here we go. I actually am going to start with a response to Dr. Yaden here, but would be very happy to have anybody weigh in. So I love your caution, Dr. Yaden, about over extrapolations from psychedelic experiments. I'm getting maybe that this is too loud. Can we turn the volume down just a little bit? Por favor. Cool. Oh. Alrighty. Okay, so I definitely appreciate the cautions about over extrapolating, about naively supposing that we can make conclusions about life, the universe, and everything because of an altered state of the human nervous system. However, across multiple traditions, you have this conceptual dichotomy of a microcosm and a macrocosm. This shows up, for example, in Tantric Hinduism, in Christian mysticism by way of St. Bonaventure and the Journey of the Mind into God, in the Renaissance classic Dialogues of Love, and the section on cosmic love, and the idea that there is a recapitulation within the human psyche of patterns that typify a larger cosmic order. Okay, so even more modestly from, a pure evolutionary biological point of view, if you take this analogy of the human body and form being a lump of wax and the signet or the seal being pressed onto it, that signet being the matrix or the cosmos and all the collective forces that shaped the human form over these eons of evolutionary selection, it seems that even at a most modest evolutionary level, that it would be appropriate to infer that there are in fact things that we can infer about higher order patterns and properties by careful experimental observation of the human psyche. And then again, depending on how much deference or openness we're willing to lend to traditions like Tantric Hindu traditions, Christian mystic traditions, these Renaissance philosophical traditions, and claims of a microcosmic, macrocosmic, fractal-like relationship, then it seems that there could be space even for some wider relational observations of what's happening at a cosmic level based on careful experimental observation of the human level. And I'd be curious, Dr. Yaden, if you'd be willing to agree that perhaps there can be some extrapolations with careful experimental observations, or if you really think that that's just an entirely wrong-headed direction of thinking.
Yeah, I think it's an entirely wrong-headed way of thinking. I think, I think there's any number of interpretations and inferences that can come from experiences that even are similar. But, as Dr. Strassman emphasized, there are different experiences across traditions, and there's real danger in trying to find too much similarity across all of these various traditions, or because I think when you look at the record, there really is quite a substantial amount of diversity. And so I don't know how much, well, maybe we could talk about the context of exploration in the context of justification. I think it's quite possible that various altered states can provide useful and interesting new perspectives to explore. They can really aid in the context of exploration. But in terms of the context of justification, yeah, I don't think that an argument from experience, or just to simply say, well, I had this phenomenological experience, I don't think that provides enough reason or evidence to provide a firm basis for an inference about the nature of reality. So I think we need to be really careful about making those leaps and check ourselves with a healthy dose of skepticism when we're tempted to make an inference about the nature of reality after an experience that we just had.
Yeah, one of the definitions of psychedelics that I like is one which comes from Ido Hartogsen, and I'm in Israel, and he calls these meaning enhancing drugs. So all because the meaning is enhanced, doesn't mean it's true.
Question for the panel, and some of you addressed this in your talks a little bit, but I'm curious for each of you, what do you think are the risks of studying spirituality at the level of brain sciences?
Well, the main risk, from my point of view, is defining spirituality. You know, if I mean, if spirituality means one thing to one group of scientists and something else, to another group of scientists, you're in the same boat with religious sectarianism.
Chime in that I think that there is a great risk of misidentifying varieties of explanations as competing explanations. And so particularly when we start talking about subjective first-person accounts and then putting those in conversation with objective material accounts from neurosciences, thinking that we now have to put them into a battle with one another and that somehow having a material account will eliminate even the need for subjective accounts, I think is a great risk of this type of pursuit. But I also think that the great opportunity is to have multidimensional narratives, or in other words, a real credence and reverence, if you will, even for the dignity and the value of the subjective first-person account in conversation with the objective material accounts for these types of experiences.
Well, I think there needs to be some peer review of the subjective experiences, so people don't start just making up crazy ideas which they justify because of their experience. And that's where the importance of tradition comes to the fore. You can, well, the notion of false prophecy. I mean, it's a very important topic. Are you seeing things more clearly as a result of particular altered states, or are you not seeing them more clearly?
Is that working? There we go. Yeah, I think there's a risk when you're studying on the brain level of missing the qualitative experiences that you have. The phenomenological features of spirituality. Also, there's a risk of kind of taking the magic out of it, I guess is one way to say it. I think, I think of my children looking at a phone and thinking, wow, that's amazing, it's magic. But would they think it's less cool if they understood exactly how it worked and that somebody made that? And I would say no. I think that as you come to learn more about the mechanics of things, you actually come to appreciate them more. And so I think that while there might be a risk of maybe demystifying or taking the magic out of it, I think in a lot of ways there would actually be more of a reverence of these spiritual experiences as you learn more about them on the brain level.
Yeah, I guess I agree with what's been said. For me, the risk is one of emphasis, which is we're so early in our brain science development, and the stuff that Dr. Ferguson is working on and others is amazing. Technologically and scientifically, it's really interesting. But it's been well established that when people see a brain image, their attention is riveted. And it may be a small sample size, it might be a preliminary finding, and we might emphasize that more than maybe a very well-established behavioral finding or a psychometric finding that's been confirmed on tens of thousands of participants. So I think maybe not so much of a risk, but it's just when we talk about brain research, we also want to think about behavioral and psychological findings as well.
I want to riff on something that Janae was saying, and then David bring in one of the data points from your presentation here. And so Janae, you're referring to this risk of disenchantment or loss of wonder, loss of awe, if there is some kind of a mechanistic understanding. And so putting that then in conversation, David, with your observation that for individuals who don't identify as theistic, who are quote unquote non-believers, that preferred terminology for these types of rarefied experiences is transcendent. And that is so striking to me, and even a little bit troubling, that if we contrast that with immanent, there's this notion that for it to be wondrous or amazing or awesome, that it has to be a flight away from, as opposed to a full embodiment of. You know, I wonder if there is some way in which even that data point that transcendent is a preferred word is nodding to something that is indicating an utter disenchantment altogether, an utter rejection of the possibility that our very physical corporeal existence and being can itself be awesome and wonderful and magical, as it were. I don't know. I'm curious if you could just riff for a minute on your thoughts of that transcendent language preference to describe these experiences.
Yeah, so we have to be careful. You know, we, the panelists, and probably everyone in this audience, we use these words in different ways than most people would, and probably most people who answered our survey wouldn't contrast transcendence and immanence. That's a fairly highbrow knowledge base you need to draw from for that. I mean, I think there's probably what we'd call like a folk or a lay definition of transcendence, which just simply refers to specialness in a way that sounds less religious. So for me, I think, you know, it'd be interesting actually to do some semantic experimental philosophy on these concepts and see what people actually mean by them. But yeah, my gut sense, and from drawing from some of the qualitative data, is that transcendence wouldn't be the opposite of immanence. It would rather just be a secular way of pointing to a special experience.
Yeah, it could emphasize the enhancement of meaning. Danny Friedman, one of the mentors behind my DMT work, used to use the word portentous. That LSD increased portentousness, which I guess if we're kind of using elastic terms, could fall or overlap Venn diagram wise with transcendence, if we're talking about transcendence as just profound or more powerful.
Or we open it up to audience questions. We saw that figure that 40% of, I think it was Americans, had felt a presence larger than themselves, or they'd had some kind of religious experience. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on, okay, the other 60%, what's going on with them? And what do you make of this wide individual variation in propensity to seek out spiritual or religious experiences, propensity to have them? What do you all think is driving that?
Well, one of the interesting things about DMT is it's made in the human brain. It's an endogenous, psychedelic. So, we don't really know much about the regulation of DMT synthesis. Concentrations are quite high. They're comparable to serotonin and of dopamine, canonical neurotransmitters. So it could be that there's polymorphisms out there. Some people may produce more DMT, some people may produce less. There's other potential candidates, but we know the most, which is not that much, so far about endogenous DMT. So there could be some biological component.
Yeah, I think there's biological, psychological, and social reasons for the individual variation. Yeah, there's some biological reasons, probably at the genetic level, and Michael's pointed to some of these structural differences in the brain, perhaps. psychometrically, like in terms of personality research, we know people who are more open to experience, surprise, surprise, have more of these kinds of unusual experiences. The trait absorption, which is we know genetically influenced trait, the ability and desire to engage deeply with emotional and imaginal experiences is highly predictive. Socially, probably if you happen to brush up against particular movements, religious or spiritual groups, meditation groups, for example, that emphasize these kinds of experiences. So I think it's definitely multifactorial and at the biological, psychological, and social levels to account for that individual variation.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I'll also add that speculatively, I could imagine that there is a golden ratio, as it were, from an evolutionary perspective for adaptive function that, you know, may even vary across time and across different socio-technological matrices of existence. I think, for example, of, again, Teresa of Avila, to bring her up again, she talks about this relationship of contemplatives and then actives. In other words, people who are just more oriented toward pragmatism and really aren't inclined to sit around meditating and praying in states of rapture and ecstasy for hours a day. And she says, you contemplatives, don't look down on the actives. Don't for a second think you're any better or more special than they are, that if we were all contemplatives, nothing would function. And so the degree to which there is this ratio that, again, might have a golden variety that itself fluctuates depending on our sociocultural, technological, evolutionary contexts.
Okay, does anyone in the room have a question? Oh, lots of questions, okay. Oh, there's no mic. Oh, we gotta walk around, all right. I think if you yell, the Zoom folks can't hear you, so I'll just ban a white.
Well, yeah.
Well, you can repeat the question.
What is this?
Well, a very quick question. First of all, thank you all. What a joyous moment, and so many questions come to mind. But anyway, one that comes specifically, you know, we're in adolescence of understanding all these wonderfully important topics. But one to Michael, Mr. Ferguson, was I'm thinking of the work of Ian McGilchrist about the hemispheric. Did you find in your research, you know, any correlation specifically to right and left hemisphere as far as, you know, to validate what he's thinking, because it seems so important. Anyway.
Yeah, great question here. So if I'm understanding what you're asking here, it's Ian McGilchrist's observation or his proposition that the right hemisphere is more holistic in nature, left hemisphere is more detailed in nature, and that we have this in the, you know, the post-industrial West, this unbalanced tilt toward, you know, left hemispheric or detail-oriented ways of thought. That definitely does show up when you're looking at things, for example, like prosody versus semantics and linguistic processing. So the right hemisphere and insults to the language homologues of the right hemisphere will create a loss of just that artistry, that rhythmicity, that tonicity of language, as opposed to insults to the left hemisphere will be aphasia, that it's, you can't grasp the specific word. So that dichotomy definitely does pop up in various ways. With the connectivity to the periaqueductal gray and its distributed networks, we didn't see that specific lateralized effect, but we also weren't necessarily testing for something that would have revealed that same type of, you know, detail holistic difference there. But again, thinking in terms of the language differences of semantic versus prosodic insults, it seems that there is something there, at least at the neural level.
I have a question for Dr. Yaden about the psilocybin experiments. Can you comment on how methylphenidate came to be the comparator drug, and whether you think there might be a better alternative? And also, were there any non-responders in the group of subjects whom you tested?
Yeah, good question. The question of how to provide a good control group in psychedelic studies is a really urgent one. It's really important to do methodologically so that you can compare an active control group. We know that expectancy is a hell of a drug, so to speak. And so, you really do ideally need to have an active control group. And by active control group, I mean not just taking a sugar pill, but taking something that alters you in some way, such that you think that you received the actual treatment. It's very difficult to do because of, just the very specific and characteristic subjective effects of a psychedelic. And so when you're looking at an active control, you want something that will alter your subjectivity in a dramatic way, but that will hopefully have a different mechanism of action, so that you can test the psychedelic substance and its effects individually. And so methylphenidate provides a great deal of energy. I mean, it's an amphetamine. It's an upper, so to speak. And so it has the similarity with psilocybin, and insofar as there's an activation and there's this feeling of energy, and some participants do get tricked by it. They don't know what they've gotten exactly, but pretty low percentages ultimately. There are other possibilities, like high dose THC, for example, is one idea people have talked about. But when we talk to our colleagues who study THC, they say, well, we don't know if it's actually therapeutic or has psychoplastogenetic effects. And so we don't know if that's going to be a good active control. It's one idea. Same problems, even more so with something like dextromethorphan. It may have very similar kinds of therapeutic effects. We don't really know. So this is a big problem. It's a challenge, I should say. It's something that the field is actively considering. And then your second question, what was your second question? Sorry.
Non-responders.
Non-responders.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. So I mentioned the hype bubble of psychedelics. I mean, and I said, these are not cures. And so these, when you read the clinical trials, there's absolutely non-responders. Yeah, this is not everyone has, the characteristic acute effects. Even some people say, oh, did you give me something? I mean, there are people actually who don't appear to even get the trip, so to speak. I mean, that happens. But in terms of, if you mean the therapeutic impact, absolutely. A great number of participants don't get persisting benefit for, say, depression or addiction, for example. I mean, the clinical therapeutic effects look promising, but as I tried to emphasize, a lot more research is needed to examine their real effects. When you probably saw the New England Journal article comparing an SSRI to psilocybin, and the results were mixed. And so it wasn't a slam dunk for psilocybin there by any means. And so, yeah, there definitely are non-responders, to make a long story short. I'll say a little bit also when I said the acute subjective effects, this isn't just mystical experience anymore. I have to say, Dr. Strassman's critiques are probably a decade or more out out of relevance. There's a big straw man there about what we're doing at Hopkins. I have to say. So we've
stop
done,
giving the MEQ.
well, I mean, that would be a bad idea for a number of reasons. There's a number of scales that capture what the MEQ captures, and so we have some consistency across the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness rating scale, the ego dissolution, the nada, the awe experience. I mean, these are very consistent subjective qualities that come up over and over and over again. And, you know, we've published 2 reports looking at relational experiences. So there's a DMT entity encounter paper and a God encounter survey paper. So these are things that we're measuring actively. You know, it's not like it maybe once was. I'm not sure, but certainly don't recognize our current procedures in your comments.
Well, the question of placebo is interesting. I mean, I think you can make an argument that you don't really need placebo, that you just give a psychedelic combined with a particular intervention, and then you do the intervention without the psychedelic. I think that would militate against the endless search for the appropriate placebo. So I'd like to at least.
And you haven't controlled for expectancy.
Well, I mean, people are expecting to get better. That's why they're volunteering for the study. Yeah, and with respect to non-responders, that's an interesting question as well. I would say, we probably studied 6 or so volunteers, and there were a couple who had absolutely zero response to DMT. Like you were saying, that did you give me anything? So I think those people who have absolutely no response to a strong dose of a psychedelic ought to be studied as well. I don't think it's purely psychological. There must be some metabolic or receptor affinity issues going on. Yeah, so I think the mystical experience questionnaire, yeah, I think if it's a non-issue, then I think other questionnaires ought to be able to replace what's being measured with the MEQ, because I review lots of scientific manuscripts about psychedelics, and you would not believe how many of those papers say a mystical experience correlates with this. It has to be complete, it's not incomplete, and so on. And I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've said you should, instead of saying mystical experience, you should say scores on the MEQ, or if you insist, you could say mystico-mimetic. So I don't think the mystical experience meme is anywhere near dying off.
Okay, we have 4 more questions in the room, and that will be it for questions. So
okay. Thanks so much, everyone. This has been such a wonderful presentation. Really valuable study of Mormons. I would love to talk with you more about that. So I wanted to ask, so I study mystical experiences, peak experiences, ecstasy and bliss in everyday life. And most people have had them. They're very rare. So I wanted to, and in trying to find out about this as well, I'm looking at peak experiences as an adaptive behavior. It's an evolutionary human behavior. And I'm very interested in seeing how it happens in the psychedelic therapeutic arena. I recently attended a conference in Salt Lake City of, should we say, street shaman who are trying to develop best practices and ethics and all that around using ayahuasca and psilocybin, on the street therapeutically. And so I have some concerns about this, but I heard from them, it's kind of unusual. In meditation, there's no such thing as a bad trip, is there? It doesn't seem like there's ever, there's no such thing as a bad 20 minutes of meditation. However, there's something called a bad trip. So I wondered if you could please tell me what a bad trip is and how many of your participants have had it. Because these street shamans say that a bad trip can be more effective therapeutically than a good trip. And they really don't mind when their clients have a bad trip. Thanks.
I'll let these folks take the bad trip question, but I do just want to point out that there are hellacious 20 minutes of meditation.
Oh, yeah.
There can be some really gnarly, there can be some really hellacious 20-minute segments of meditation sometimes. So there really are bad trips in meditation world too. And you get adverse effects from those. And often they are growthful, but people can get stuck too. So I just want to point out that there are such things as I would love to talk with you about it more. Yeah.
Well, I mean, everybody's got, temporary anxiety as they're going into a psychedelic experience. I mean, it's, transient, people can breathe into it or let go and they can relax and it, passes. Adverse effects in, our DMT study, I mean, we screened people very carefully. There were 2 volunteers who, suffered a recurrence of depression. They both responded, quickly to treatment. One guy got back on antidepressants, one person got into therapy. Somebody else was anally raped by crocodiles in his big DMT, session, and it horrified him. He was terror stricken. So, we supported him. Afterwards, he came into the office a handful of times for the next month or so. He stopped using drugs, that's for sure, after that experience. I think, there are adverse effects. I mean, there can be persistent anxiety, paranoia, flashbacks, this thing called, post-hallucinogen perception disorder, but it isn't, purely perceptual, it's more flashbacks. You have, certain elements of the trip come by unbidden, which can be disturbing, interfere with your life, or they may not. So I think you need to be, direct in addressing adverse effects. They're true, they're real. They're more, common in unprepared people who shouldn't be, tripping in the first place. Like if they're using other drugs, alcohol, if they've got a history of major mental illness or family history, if they didn't really consider the setting at all. But symptomatically, I mean, anything may occur as a result of a difficult session, difficult experience. Things can last 24 hours, they can last a few days, they can last a week, they can last a month, they can trigger like an episode of some major mental illness that requires treatment.
Yeah, just to also point out that there's definitely negative experiences in meditation, and even ones that can linger. There's Willoughby Britton has a Dark Night of the Soul project where she collects negative meditation experiences. So it's worth maybe looking into that. Certainly psychedelic negative experiences are more dramatic. There's a paper called the Challenging Experience Survey, which looks at acutely negative experiences, which can be ultimately therapeutic, but also experiences that are persistingly aversive, and those occur too, even in clinical settings where we've gone through extensive screening and preparation and integration. Those really do happen. So it's important that information is out there. But the risks do seem to go up recreationally. Yeah, so you don't have that screening, you don't have the preparation, you don't have the safe and supportive setting. So the risks do increase dramatically outside of those settings. Why do people have them? That's a tricky question. It's an important question, and it's one that I think will take a lot more research before we can begin to answer it. Well, I mean, we know some things like, Rick mentioned, if nervousness at the beginning of a session. We know that people with a high baseline neuroticism, a lot tendency for a lot of worry and negative emotion, they tend to have more negative or experiences or bad trips. But yeah, in terms of more than that, in terms of knowing some predictors, we don't really know the specific mechanisms as of yet.
Well, flashbacks, I think, is a good term, because it allows us to make some comparisons with PTSD, which is marked by flashbacks as well. So I think you could conceptualize, at least in some ways, the adverse effects as a response to trauma. And there are people that are more prone to suffer from trauma as compared to others.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful, and thank you for putting this together. I have a question for really all of you. There's been some really interesting differences of opinion on this panel, which has really gotten me thinking about a lot of things. My question is about the nature of religiosity, what we mean when we use that word, and it really gets at the nature of the human being. And what do you think about the idea when we're talking about this distinction between religious and secular? And some of you talked about these walls that we've drawn in our culture. Are those walls real? Or is, when we say secular, are we just talking about something that's pseudo-religious and it's just characterized by atheism, materialism, nihilism, but it's just its own kind of pseudo-religion? And that what we think of as religiosity is actually much more ubiquitous. We just don't use that word to describe it, but it shows up all over the culture, all over our politics, all over our art and our entertainment, that we're actually much more religious than we give ourselves credit for. We just don't call it that anymore.
Yeah, fantastic question. I'd love to jump in on this. So as a teaser, some of the work that I'm doing right now in progress is looking at the nature of dogmatic beliefs. And it does seem that dogmatic beliefs and various patterns of behavior associated with them are not specific to religion as we understand it in terms of tradition-oriented spiritual systems, et cetera. But you see this there's been a lot of commentary. This is certainly not original to my observations about how motifs such as orthodoxy, heresy, excommunication are things that happen all over the place outside of traditional religious institutions. And so I think that your observation is really well made here to question the degree to which, some imagined wall between quote unquote secular and quote unquote religious is not just itself a reinforcement of an order that bears all of the same hallmarks of dogmatic praxis and social punishment.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point, which is that a lot of these practices or a lot of these peak experiences happen inside of a perceptual container. And often you don't look back at the container. And so any experience is going to happen inside a cultural context. And a lot of these things that you mentioned are pseudo-religious structures. You can do science in a way that is religious and that is not using the tools of science for inquiry. And I think you're raising an interesting distinction between a peak experience that happens inside of a container and then a process that looks at the container itself.
Thank you.
Thanks for the informative panel. My question is primarily directed at Michael, but if either of you would like to comment, please do. Michael, you mentioned that spiritual acceptance was identified as being oriented to the brainstem and the periaqueductal gray. And so that arises for me that there's possibly a downward orientation to this concept of sacred. And in my stumbling in the field, I look to the origin of the word sacred, the etymology of the word sacred, and the term sacred is derived from the same root as is the word sacrum. Sacrum, okay, sacrum as in the bony projection down here in the pelvis. And so the question I have in the work that I do, I'm a trauma body worker. And I have a psychophysiology model looking at the individual and where the signal disruption is at in the whole physiology, psychophysiology. And so the question is, to what extent has the nature of the entire central nervous system been explored? And in some traditions, there's ecstatic dance, and that involves moving the entire spine. That consciousness is not just the central nervous system, but also the membrane and the bubble itself. And so that a question is, the concept of spirituality, how much does it include not only the spine, but the procreative centers of the pelvis itself? And so, small question, but I'm just curious, we're looking at like target the brain. And when a client comes in to me, who's been, a variety of medical traumas, social psychological traumas, rape when they were a child and stuff like that, I'm looking at what's their touch mechanisms? What's their sense of space, that they fill up their biofield. And so and how they connect to some quantum microtubule mechanism, so it's not just this brain orientation, it's the sense of the whole being. So I'm just kind of curious what you had riff off of that.
I love that. No, that's a beautiful question and a very insightful question. It's like I was saying, I totally came to this set of investigations with a particular bias that we were going to primarily see higher level cortical representations as grounding spiritual acceptance. And so going deeper into the brain, into the brainstem was an aha experience for me. But what you're talking about here is even next level. And I think it's the right direction to go, which is looking at the body, looking at sacred embodiment, at sacred bodies, at the way that the peripheral nervous system, at neural networks distributed through the viscera, through the heart, are participating as well in these not just experiences, but actual information processes that give rise to what we identify as sacred in nature. I think that, we have a tendency, again, to become so disembodied when it comes to spirituality and to sacredness. And what you're suggesting, I think, predicts a physiological path forward to look at signal from various centers. The language that is used in a lot of esoteric or spiritual traditions is chakras, and people can get kind of, squeamish about using that terminology. But I think that often, if you look at the correspondence of physical locations of, chakras, the heart, the sacrum, like you're talking about solar plexus, there's a lot going on in the peripheral nervous system in those same areas. And so the degree to which we can make evidence-based physiological observations of how those different centers of activity are associated with sacred experience is going to be a win. I think that that's the right direction for us to move in.
Yeah, just a quick comment then, in my model, it's my approach, it's a coherent existence. And so I think what the evolution of Western science is to, acknowledge the silo-based orientation of science, and the etymology of the word science comes from separate, incision, decision, Okay, versus what is this whole systems biology of a coherent model? And so developing the principles within our physics, biology, social sciences, and humanities. What are the core terms that we use to describe anatomy and physiology? Because right now, anatomy and physiology is this thing that happens in biology and medicine, where in the academic structure, anatomy and physiology is really what's all about. And so to elevate the concepts of anatomy and physiology, how are we understanding that? And looking cross-culturally, you know, within the evolution of the globe and how different cultures have described what is the nature of the human biology in systems biology in the ecosystem is really where we're at given climate change, for example. And so I thank you very much for the opportunity to comment.
No, totally. And I would just say that I would again speculate that maneuver of sacralizing or resacralizing the body also would have philosophical impacts that would overflow into things like human rights, social justice. I mean, you're talking about ecological considerations. So I think that there is a lot that is downstream from those potential maneuvers.
Right.
You know, I think we should be careful with those kinds of ideas. I mean, there was a paper a while back, you know, saying that, you know, psychedelics modify metaphysical beliefs. You know, so you might be more oriented towards climate change, but you might not be. You might, you know, have a flash on LSD that you're going to buy a V8 and, you know, drive it around, or you're going to join a, you know, neo-Nazi organization. So, you know, I think, you know, the idea that, you know, psychedelics are going to, or even spiritual experience, altered states of consciousness are, you know, necessarily going to lead to world peace. I mean, I hate, you know, saying this, but, you know, we, you know, thought that a long time ago. And, you know, it didn't quite pan out. I think it's, you know, the set and the setting. You work on yourself. The altered states can amplify what you're working on already. They can make more true and more meaningful what you already believe. So it's almost that you need to work on what you believe in the first place, you know, rather than, you know, hoping for an altered state or a spiritual experience or, you know, psychedelic, you know, trip to do it for you.
Thank you for a very stimulating discussion. I wonder if I'd value it very much if both Rick and David could speak to this, and welcome the panelists, though I know it's very late and I appreciate people's patience. I wonder if you could speak to how we can have conversations involving science that acknowledge people are making particular ontological, metaphysical assumptions, and yet still build those into the conversation. And that happens a lot at this conference. So there are theories of panpsychism, there's theories of near-death experiences, there's theories of collective consciousness, and so on. And it seems, and certainly when people have psychedelic experiences, that may influence their ontological views, and very well may have influenced yours and many people here in the audience. So the question is, how can we have conversations that acknowledge particular ontological views and interpretations, integrate those with scientific findings without having the scientific findings be used to necessarily say that shows that this particular view is valid or not?
Well, you know, I think we don't want to, you know, perform, you know, premature closure. I mean, we don't know how things work. And, you know, so to say that, you know, this is how things work, you know,
But
that's
what about
hubris.
putting ideas out there? So like, you know, Hammeroff has the theory, which, and Penrose have a theory in which they basically suggest, you know, consciousness is sort of a property of existence and doesn't even necessarily need to exist in matter. Are you saying they shouldn't have those theories, or they should just provide sufficient speculation?
Well, speculation, you can't prove that. I mean, how
Right.
can you prove that?
So should you not discuss it? That, I guess that's what I'm asking is.
I mean, people should be free to say whatever they're thinking.
Do you mean in a psychedelic context, like a clinical context, or
Well, you could imagine, let's take an analogy of near-death experiences, and people might want to entertain the possibility that near-death experiences were actually reflecting a consciousness persisting past death. And it doesn't show that, but can't we have theories that consider that as a possibility and then follow through with the implications? Can't we have theories which consider the possibility that people are having true spiritual experiences as opposed to purely illusory ones?
Well, I mean, all because you might, trip and you're convinced that consciousness continues after death. That doesn't mean consciousness persists after death. I mean, you need to study it, and that's going to be a very difficult study to perform.
But yeah, of course, people believe all kinds of different things. I'm having trouble understanding if the question is maybe about research settings or clinical settings, because when we're doing scientific research, maybe that's what you have in mind.
I guess it's about theories. Are theories allowed to take particular ontological positions and explore their implications, or do we just have, as long as we acknowledge that this is just a speculation or an ontological assumption, and then seeing where the theory goes?
Who is doing the allowing? I mean, like it depends the setting, I think. I mean, in a clinical setting, it really matters that we don't push our views, our metaphysical views on patients or clients. Or in a research setting, we don't want to push metaphysical views. These are, and we want to also, I think, make participants and patients aware that these kinds of experiences can sometimes result in belief changes. I mean, I think in these settings, we really want to think very, very carefully about the assumptions that we're making about metaphysical beliefs, and try to be as ethical as possible, frankly, about how we handle these assumptions, and treat these beliefs with a lot of respect and not push beliefs on people. But it sounds like you're not talking about these research or clinical contexts. You're just saying in general. And I think in general, yeah, I mean, we all believe in all kinds of different things. Yeah, there's no arbiter or authority that's going to tell you can't believe those things. I'm not sure if I'm answering or addressing your question or not, though.
Thank you.
Well, you develop a theory based on data, and then you run experiments. And if the data confirms your theory, then you're that much further ahead. If you have to change your theory, I mean, it's the scientific process.
Right, but theories always go way beyond the data. They provide a framing that includes the data, but they add to it. But thank you very much for your comments.
Maybe much like we do financial disclosures, we should do belief disclosures in our papers. Yeah.
Well, that's not a bad idea, is to spell out the expectations and the belief system of research teams. Expectancy, like David was saying, is very powerful. There's demand characteristics that are unconsciously transmitted, and demand effects, which confirm the demand characteristics of the setting. So if people believe, well, back in the day, when psychedelics were called psychotomimetics, you would give somebody LSD, you would put them on a gurney, tie them down, keep them in seclusion, look through the window every so often. And, people got psychotic because the people giving the drugs, believed they were, psychotomimetic. So, the demand characteristics resulted in a particular outcome. So, I think it's important. It would be hard to describe like as, part of materials and methods, like our group, believes in this. But still, I mean, there ought to be some way to make it more explicit.
So this is fantastic. We're already keeping Dr. Yaden 45 minutes up later than we told him that we were going to. So thank you for sticking around almost till 1 a.m.
1 a.m. Wow.
And this is wonderful. We have more people who want to ask questions. We are going to cut it off now, but we're going to keep this conversation going because clearly there is a lot of energy and interest and curiosity here, which I see as an extremely positive thing. I'd like to ask that we please give our panelists a round of applause here, and also our audience members, especially for sticking around longer than the advertised time. Thank you so much. Once again, meditation tomorrow morning is going to start at 7:30 a.m. with Dr. Chopra, and I look forward to a fantastic week with all of you here.
Thanks you,
everyone.
Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.